In this video, we are going to provide an introduction to Spring MVC. So MVC is a very common design pattern for GUI and web applications. It actually stems from a number of different programming languages. I'm honestly not sure of the origin of MVC. It's been around for long before I started programming, so that's been quite some time. So MVC stands for Model View Controller. So it's a programming paradigm as to how you develop applications. So here in a web context, we get a client request. That request gets handled by the controller. Now, the controller really kind of acts as a traffic cop as to handling the request and facilitating response. So that controller may or may not need to invoke some biz logic on the back end of it. So that's usually not shown in it, but the controller, the result of what the controller does, it's going to be population of a model. Consider that model basically a POJO. Some type of data structure. So that model is provided to view, and that view layer handles the rendering of the request as to how the client requests the data. So in a GUI application, the view could be the object that creates basically the GUI display. In a web application, if it's a browser requesting data, the view would be producing the HTML that gets provided back to the client. So it's a very solid and very common design pattern. So you'll have a controller that handles the request. You have a model that is independent of the request. And also the view becomes an interchangeable component. So you can handle different view technologies without the controller nor the model necessarily needing to change. So just to go over the terminology a little bit more here, a model in our context within Spring MVC, that is going to be a simple POJO, plain old Java object. It's going to have a collection of properties which may or may not be used by the view. The view, that is going to be the data as requested by the client. A lot of people think of that in context of it being JSP or Timeleaf or Jackson or some type of other implementation technology. Not necessarily so. I consider the view as to what is produced. So you're going to invoke Timeleaf to create HTML. You're going to use Jackson to provide the client back JSON. And if you look at the HTTP specification, there's allowance in the headers for the client to say what they want back, whether they want HTML back, JSON back, text back. So there's a number of different things that the client can request. The view is going to provide that. The controller, often that is kind of vague as to how that should be implemented. I like to see controllers implemented very simply. I think that they should be like a traffic cop. They should have minimal business logic. Often you're going to see this work in conjunction with some type of service, a custom service that you write. That is where you're going to put the business logic. That's where you'll do type transformations, where you'll interact with the database, persistence operations, or fetch operations. That should be done within the service. Granted, you can do this in the controller. I just think the implementation becomes a lot more cleaner if you do it within a service and allow that controller to focus on its purpose, which is to be a controller of facilitating the request. Now, Spring MVC, in context, it gets a little more complicated. When we have a client request comes in, what happens is Spring is registering what's called a dispatcher servlet within Tomcat. That servlet is going to handle the routing to the controller that you write to handle a specific request. That controller typically is going to interact with a service. Here in this section of the course, we will be looking at Spring Data JPA. That service will invoke Spring Data JPA to interact with the database, to either persist or fetch data from the database, and then the service will be providing results to the controller. The controller, through the Spring framework, that is going to be populating a model. That model ultimately gets passed back to the view technology for the proper rendering. In this example, we will be using Timeleaf to generate the view. That view is going to be HTML, which gets provided back to the client. So hopefully this diagram does help you envision the different components as to how the request flows through the Spring framework. You have the request, goes to the dispatcher servlet. That invokes the controller. The controller is going to do its work in conjunction with the service in Spring Data JPA. The result of the controller is to provide back to Spring Framework a model object that will get passed to the appropriate view technology to provide the view rendering, which is then passed back to the client. So a few moving pieces there. When you see it in action, which it will soon do, it's actually fairly simple, but keep this diagram in the back of your mind because a lot of it we are not really handling. As far as code that we write, we won't see this dispatcher servlet. We actually don't see much of the view either. So we're primarily going to write a Java class for the controller. We'll write a service. We will have a data model that we pass back to the model, and then we allow the time-leaf template to do the rendering. So a lot of moving parts here, but the Spring MVC framework really does take a lot of the work and coordination from us, allows us to focus on business logic as we build out our application.